Ben. I'll be your chair for the round, and as far as I can remember, I'm solo chair. Um, and a few reminders: just keep within time, respect each other, be engaging. Debating on the motion about alternative learning systems. Let's have Prime Minister. PM. Okay, sige.
Hello, am I audible?
Yep, yep. Audible.
Okay. Let me just set my timer real quick. Sorry. Okay. Beginning my speech then in three, two, one, go. When students are even struggling to go to school, when students, even without a completely empty schedule, are struggling to attend school and struggling to understand the extensive and lengthy curriculum that teachers aren't even in the proper position to teach, given the fact that they have given that they have so much students to teach, given that they have so much to process. I think it's important to assess what other alternatives we have, what other possibilities there are to empower our youth, especially within the Filipino context. But before we get into all of this, let's look into some important definitions of status quo. The biggest problem right now, especially right now when it comes to education, is that students lack the fundamental skills to even proceed with advanced learning. These people who normally need these skills in order to learn, primarily people who are in the informal sector, like those informal sector, people that you see on the side, women with multiple burdens, people who have disabilities, indigenous peoples who have huge cultural differences and do not have the ability, they have the documents in order to pursue more formal forms of education. That's those people have the biggest ability to not even proceed with advanced learning. They don't have the basic necessities like literacy or basic literacy or mathematics in order to proceed with the advanced learning. They don't even have the ability to attend these formal sectors. What is ALS then? ALS is something that would be normally headed by the government, or in this case, DepEd. Their curriculum would more normally take things like basic math and literacy. They would have home economics and basic funding and finances, and this would overall be very state funded. You don't have to pay for all of this. Unlike a tuition fee in schools, you don't even have to pay a single peso just to get into all of this. It's simply online. You can attend to it anytime you want. It's very flexible. You don't have to go to a place. You just have to open your. The only thing that you would ever have to spend on is probably Wi-Fi. It's probably like electricity and Wi-Fi, rather than having to spend good money on gas in order to go to school, having to spend money on tuition, having to spend money on books, only to just to get things that you barely even understand. So, what does more development look like then? We think firstly means more investment. It's a decentralized form, so it's spread out over various spaces like rural areas. There's a trade-off that even though there's no formal space usually, so it probably happens in barangay areas or online, it's probably okay because many of the said marginalized groups, again, don't have the capacity to move out of their homes for their case. And even if it's online, it's probably okay anyways also, because usually already happens in traditional hybrid school systems too. And the only thing that changes on our side is that it focuses specifically on the most proximate needs on the people. We think secondly, more recognition also means that there are more informal types of learning that people opt into. For example, random tutors in their barangays or organizations doing it for them. The problem is that they're usually not regulated. For example, they're biased to non-licensed teachers who abuse licensed teachers and abuses students. We need more recognition that people need to have in education. The problem is that PWDs cannot, excuse me, okay, cannot, excuse me, sorry for that, cannot fend for themselves. So a lot of the issues then that we see is that, I'm so sorry, cannot fend themselves and have to rely on their family support. Families have to take out more loans and utang. So this has become a cyclical issue because they have no basic learnings. They cannot be accepted into regular school systems because they cannot pass any entrance exams. They can't have a resume or job experience because of this. They can basically do absolutely nothing because they don't have the basic life skills in order to pursue a higher educational learning, and thus they fall into the cycle of poverty. We have two we have two arguments then about why ALS would be so much better than. We think firstly is that why traditional school enrollment is just as bad for the stakeholders we want to protect. Firstly, we think it's not very accessible for the people. Good state universities are usually concentrated in urban areas, but even if they have access to state universities in urban Manila, they still have to compete with the rich kids. Like, for example, those rich people going to UP Diliman or something, who have to Harding, literally all of the slots. There's a lack of investment and focus on the development of rural areas or areas that are isolated. Traditional schools are left stagnant and underdeveloped. For example, there's a lack of textbooks, unconductive learning spaces, and just an overall lack of teachers. There's a lack of basically everything. There's also way too much bureaucracy and too much folders. You have too much documents even to just enroll. I know, I'm aware, and also they're not conductive. That's also very not conductive. So what is the premise then with all these arguments? We think that it's often these individuals that live in isolated areas or indigenous groups that fall behind and don't have any access to educational opportunities. They cannot compete with other students who have more advanced skills and access to educational resources. For example, review centers, tutors, and have flexible time schedules. The PhD educational system is super competitive. It's tailored to the demands of the global market. For example, building globally competitive individuals who are fit for this global market. So, for example, the Philippine educational calendar follows the US calendar, exporting individuals to other countries. This educational system does not fit their needs at all. It's way too fast-paced. It doesn't address these individuals' needs and gaps of these students. There's a lack of teachers. These teachers can't always accommodate the individual needs of these students. Realize that these teachers also struggle with their own stuff. They have loans, they handle 60 students, etc., etc. So this is why we have mass promotion. We need to promote students, even if they can't even solve basic math or are stagnant. The focus is not only learning about on grades, but also palatable how they are to the global market. Second argument then, let me make this real quick and wrap up. ALS is the needed prerequisite to all educational needs of the marginalized students. Premise, firstly, ALS prioritizes basic life skills. It's not an in-depth analysis of 50 subjects that students can't even keep up with even an empty schedule. It has a fixed time and places for this curriculum. Students need basic life skills even to order to get into schools where they need literacy, which the next generation is notoriously have little of, and they need mathematics and the ability. This is the prerequisite for them to get into traditional schools. Structure. So how do we encourage more people to truly go to school, at least empower them to be more educated? Two structural reasons real quick. Firstly, the opportunities that they face. It gives them the basic experience of what a school system truly looks like. For example, culture of collaboration and communication over a diverse set of people. Secondly, it's way more easy to digest. It starts simple. Basic literacy and basic writing schools like basic English and Tagalog. And it's mostly taught in their dialect because it's targeted towards them, which is most likely since it's targeted in specific areas. It's not going to be pressured to understand all of this within one school year. All of this proves to you with more reasons of why ALS is the reason to go in order to even get these people into education that you need. If you want to see more people into the education, follow Gov. Thank you. I'm very proud to propose.
Thank you, PM. Now let's have Leader of Opposition.
Hello, am I audible?
Yep, clear.
Okay, just give me a second to fix my notes. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Insofar as the traditional education, such as being able to graduate high school and go to university, is still seen as the path to success, what we need to acknowledge coming from side opposition is that this is a mindset that's not so easily changed. What this means is that investing in ALS is not enough to uplift these youths from poverty. It is not enough to make their lives better. What we need at the end of the day is still traditional school enrollment. 2 points of setup then, given that I think that government was quite lacking in this debate. The first is how ALS is different from traditional school enrollment, given that I think that government comes with a flimsy case that this can just be used to replace everything that you need. What we need to note is that these are non-formal education initiatives, right? Meaning that at the point where they focus on basic literacy and life skills, they often give up being able to focus on explaining things that are needed for you to be able to attend university and to open up a wider job market for you. We need to note two things then as to how these are incredibly different. The first is that these are often treated as a supplement to traditional school enrollment, meaning that it is assumed that at the point in time where you enter ALS that you have some basic level of education. It often builds on these schools. If you are unable to have any formal schooling then before this point, oftentimes ALS is going to fail you entirely. This is compared to traditional school enrollment where it's you start from the beginning. This is not meant to replace it altogether. The second point then is that this ALS, by the virtue of what it ends up focusing on, just encompasses very limited topics. Insofar as one, there's just capacity to teach this on the field, and two, kids just have a bit less time. With traditional forms of schooling, then you can just have a bit more knowledge, and it can just be far more in depth. What we need to note here is that ALS specifically is for out of school youth who have already been failed by the traditional school and school system. I mean that if we're able to fix it on our side, we remove a lot of the issues that they say on how PWDs, minorities, etc., are just going to be worse off. Even then, if we do have to trade off that these are people who are going to be worse off within the short term, we think that what we're able to provide in the long run is just to open up more opportunities for them. Secondly, what exactly does prioritization of development and recognition of ALS look like? At the point where government concedes that they're going to do things such as pour more funding into this, what we need to note here is that the state has limited resources, meaning that they have less for increasing traditional school enrollment as a whole. This means that when you pour resources into ALS, such as funding and manpower, this tends to affect traditional school enrollment in two ways. That one, there's just less of ability and of efforts to improve traditional school enrollment in terms of the quality of education that they provide. But two, there's also just less resources put into fixing the underlying reasons as to why traditional schooling lacks people right now. So for issues that they explain, such as poverty or the fact that there's lacking schools within rural areas, we think that it's on our side where we're able to pour the resources into developing traditional school systems here, that we're able to explain that these are people who are able to access information at this point, access education at this point of time. What government ends up defending on their side then is just limited access to schools. Note that is something that is important insofar as even if they're able to explain that you get access to ALS at the bare minimum, they aren't able to explain why ALS is still going better by traditional school system than the traditional school system, assuming that we're able to fix all of these issues. Two arguments then. The first is on why we're able to get more quality education. The first thing that I want to note under this is as to why ALS can't be sufficient at this point in time. There are three things under this. The first is that ALS just ends up catering to a limited subset of the population. Insofar as it is only out of school youth that are going to go to ALS, and these are often people who have been failed by society. What we need to note here is that these are the people at the margins as opposed to the majority who are still receiving an education that just isn't enough. I mean that even if you improve ALS at this point in time, you're unable to cater towards other people who might end up being continuing to fail over generations. The second is that no matter how many resources are poured into ALS specifically, you are inherently constrained by the way that it is structured. Given that it is a non-formal educational initiative, what this means is that even if you teach one particular kid, they are less likely to be able to retain that information insofar as you aren't putting in a lot of effort into improving their lives as a whole. But third, it's just the fact that ALS just isn't as respected by society right now. So this happens for reasons outside of stigma that recognition might be able to fix, but it's also just the reality that they aren't as prepared as what happens when you graduate from a traditional school system that makes you ready to, for example, engage with all things from economics to literacy as a whole. Why then do we think traditional schools are better, and why is it more important to invest into it? The first is just that all people are required to go to basic education, meaning that on magnitude, we're just able to up a greater number. The second is that insofar as traditional schooling goes and uncovers a variety of fields, we think that it just means that people are prepared regardless of what they end up going into. But lastly, it's just the fact that more opportunities are likely to come from this insofar as this is a field that is less stigmatized. I think that what government needs to concede here is that even if you're able to provide some level of recognition for where you're able to get employment, this is a limited form that often still leaves you going into minimum wage jobs. What are the impacts then? We think that with being able to invest in traditional school employment, we get four things. The first is just that with investment, you get more enrollment towards these schools insofar as you're able to invest in these things, such as, for example, if you give the example of UPD having limited slots, you're able to open up more slots to a greater majority. It looks like things such as making schools more accessible towards PWDs and thus making them be able to go to it. So we're able to fix a lot of the issues that already come out from government. The second is because the second impact is just these people, these minorities are also just able to get a better education. Insofar as traditional schools are more geared to you learning specifically as opposed to you only going into specific vocational aspects, you're just able to get these benefits. The third is that there's also a lot of things that you're able to garner. Outside of this, what we need to note is that these youths are still kids, meaning that oftentimes they still want to engage with social aspects that you can only get under proven infrastructure. But last is just prestige. With the fact that they are able to, for example, get a high school degree, we think they're able to open up more options for these individuals. By the end, I think we're able to prove that these are people who just get more quality education in greater numbers. The second argument then is that what we need to note is that with the shift in priorities, the state just has no incentives to fix a lot of the current lapses within the educational system. So a lot of the problems that they introduce, such as underfunding or not enough attention being put on kids within traditional education, is the reason why a lot of individuals currently choose to pursue ALS. With the push towards ALS as a whole, it just means that the state has no incentive to fix this insofar as one, ALS signal being able to push and prioritize development in this just means that ALS is already signaled as doing something, therefore people take it and leave it. But also just that oftentimes you'd see it as a viable option without necessarily knowing that it should be the last resort. So a lot of people go into this without necessarily preparing for a better future as a whole. The way that we fix this then specifically is by the fact that one, we're able to get more attention on it insofar as people see that it has a right to access, meaning that they inherently push the government more to do things such as increase enrollment. But secondly, it's also just that as individuals, you just get the idea that this regular schooling is still something that should be valued. At the end of the day, I think we're able to reduce the number of people who go into ALS to begin with. These are marginalized people who wouldn't have options otherwise. But secondly, for everyone, education just gets better. For these reasons and more, oppose.
Thank you, LO. Now let's have Deputy Prime Minister.
Hi, wait, let me just fix my notes. Thank you. Okay, so sorry. Hi, can I be heard?
Yes, audible.
Okay. Um, wait, let me just set up my timer. Okay. Starting my speech in three, two, one, go. The point in which the Philippine education system no longer works for these people, for the vast majority of people, for example, these indigenous individuals that we ought to protect, I think that's the point in which we have to invest in the ALS system, right? So 4 points of rebuttals. First, and I think this is where we take this debate, right, is that they never analyze the prerequisite to getting hired, to getting the path of success in the first place. Because yes, we recognize that these universities are the path to success, but to realize that that only applies to the top 5% of the country, that compromises of the rich, right? These people who actually graduate from top universities and actually have the skills that are marketable towards the global market, or to the people that are employing these students. But two, they never explain as to how you're able to get like the financial capacity for these students to enter into these traditional schools. They only tell you, okay, they only tell you, okay, we're going to expand the slots, but they don't necessarily like tell you how they're going to do this, when they don't address it from the when they don't address like the individual, like for example, the individual struggles of these students, right? But three, that's also because these people who get hired have these skills in the first place. Because the thing is, right, in the current status quo, they don't have these skills in the first place. Like what we told you, the fact that some of these like students are literally graduating, are literally passing elementary without even having the prerequisite skills, without even being capable of solving basic math. So even if you come from a university, you're still likely to land, or like a university in the province, for example, you're still likely to land a blue collar job as compared to the existing people who have the privilege already of basically just being rich in general, to be able to like get a lot of the benefits that you try to that you try to posit at the end of the day, right? So what does my partner do? I think the basic thing that my partner just does is saying that if you want to even get these benefits of being hired, for example, that the prerequisite to that is having the skills that you need in the first place, right? Because listen, these for example, these companies, they don't want to hire people, obviously, that there's less propensity for them to hire people for example, from landlocked areas, people who aren't who don't have the necessary skills, right, to be able to work in these companies, for example. So I think in that sense, we already addressed the biggest burden that they posit, right? But then second is that you trade off these people with special needs, right? Realize in their speech, they literally tell you it's okay that they trade off these people with special needs, but that literally comprises majority of the population, right? These people who don't have these skills in general, but it is these people that are seen as unimportant on opposition side, and we think that that is so dangerous, right? Because it is the same system that focuses on mass promotion, that focuses on being able to market these people to the global market instead of their actual skills that you end up prioritizing at the end of the day. So on our side, we at least protect these people on the ground, even if that means having to focus on these alternative learning systems, right? Alternative learning systems first. But three, it's not accessible to the vast majority. They tell you that it's not accessible to the vast majority because it's usually out of school youth that they cater to. I think that this is untrue, because it's not about the fact that it's unaccessible because it's only going to cater to out of school youth. It's the fact that we need to have an option that is present for them in the first place. When we see that school isn't generally accessible to them. But number four, most of the things that they mentioned, such as social experiences, are things that they can gain from other areas, and are things that are generally low impact, because it's not about being, but because firstly, it is these people who are often exposed to the burdens of life. So we think that they're still able to access it through other means. But two, we think that this still has to exist at the end of the day, at the point at which these traditional schools or universities aren't accessible to them, right? So what is the basic thing that we push for here? We think that in order for you to even get to these universities in the first place, to be able to get these skills, that you have to get these prerequisite competencies first in order for you to be able to be competent to get these to land these jobs, to be able to study within these schools in the first place, right? So onto my analysis. I think firstly, traditional learning systems are forever going to be biased towards the top to the top majority of the population. We already told you that even if you are going to get into these universities, even if the state is going to invest into a lot of these state universities, we think that a lot of these rich students are still likely going to hoard these slots. Like for example, those who have access to review centers, right? So even if for example all of these people pass state univs, we think that it's more likely that these companies, for example, or these firms are going to hire the people, or are going to hire these people who are probably rich, or these people who have comparatively more skills, or comparatively more competent with basic competencies, as opposed to the other individuals that you're likely going to put, right? But number two, realize that a lot of these students as well, coming from indigenous areas, landlocked areas, generally they aren't able to catch up with the current classes that we have, given that they highly given that they're highly competitive by nature with the focus that it has on grades, but then number two, just the fact that from the get-go they already lack these prerequisite skills. So even if you all place them in the same like state university or like in the same university, we think that they're still likely going to be disadvantaged at the end of the day. So on that, to my second analysis on the positive case, why ALS is the prerequisite to learning about the skills you need to the path of success, which is where we co-opt the benefits that you have on opposition. RPM tells you, firstly, RPM tells you that the system as a whole is bad, but we will be charitable at this point and enable the current system that prioritizes this harmful competitive that you try to competitiveness that you harbor on their side. We think that it is now tailored to the demands because of the fact that the current system is tailored to the demands of the global market, like quote unquote building globally competitive individuals. Like for example, how the PIDC education system literally follows the US school calendar. Sorry, I'm not taking that. Or like how it prioritizes exporting individuals to other countries. At the very least, now you're able to like have a better diagnosis, a better assessment or prioritization of the skills that you're not able to actually develop. Because the comparative and opposition, right, is that because of the fact that you have to catch up with so many lessons, so many like areas of focus, right, that you're not able to get adequate assessment of these skills, right? So at the very least, now you have the opportunity or you have the chance to be able to like develop these skills the own time. Why is this so important? I think firstly on the individual level, which my team already talks about, the fact that these are necessary to like these fundamental skills are necessary to life in general. But I think on the bigger scale is the fact that because these industries or like these firms, they highly prioritize these highly skilled individuals. We think that's that's the urgency that we posit, right? The fact that you need to learn these skills first. But then we bite the bullet that, okay, it's gonna take more time having to learn these skills. I think that we'd rather take that if that means being able to actually listen to the needs of these students, right? Being actually able to like develop the competencies that these students have. But three, why is ALS the prerequisite to dismantling this current system in the first place? And this is the margin of change. Because first, aside from greater assessment, we think that there's an inherent push to learn about these skills, especially when the education system is so centered on this competitiveness. But three, because of the fact that they don't prioritize knowledge heavy in tech subjects, like for example, STEM. But four, it empowers rural sectors because most education is focused on the rich capitals and cities of the country, right? So we think that in this case, right, so like what do we do then? I think firstly, we already solve a lot of the like harms that are posited on the ground. But two, we give you just wrapping up. But two, we give you the prerequisite that opposition doesn't really talk to you about at the end of the day. And for all of these reasons and more, if you want these students to develop, please side with government.
Thank you so much, DPM. Now let's have Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Hello. Am I audible?
Audible and visible.
Thank you. Why is ALS currently enough? Firstly, the out-of-school youth are a fairly small percentage in society, so we don't understand why such an expansion has to overcompensate for these things. Secondly, ALS now currently is used as a bridge to formal education. That is to say that if formal education is limited on their side, it no longer becomes a bridge because you lack things like expanding budgets, expanding scholarships, and all of that. Thirdly, ALS has a distinct political stakeholder base that gets stable funding and is distinct from other bases simply because it is not in competition with other educational forms. So on Gov, you basically create a competition with formal education on their side. And I'll explain in my speech why that is so bad. The conclusion of this first part is that we agree with all of the benefits of ALS on government. We are not taking away the ALS system. We'd rather just not have it become a priority in the global landscape or in the entire landscape of educational funding institutions. Some direct responses. Firstly, it's on the ALS being a prerequisite skill. I wanna like dispel this quickly. Firstly, this is not exclusive to ALS. Take note, ALS talks about basic life skills and basic literacy, things that can be accessed in many different ways and in many different forms, such as things like community education, which, by the way, many community education institutions or many community education initiatives are formed and funneled and funded by formal traditional schooling. That is to say that you have like institutions such as La Salle or Ateneo either send students to teach the formalized traditional systems in different communities, either in like by setting up certain camps or by doing these things like in CWATs or having charity and corporate social responsibility programs. These things are extensions of the traditional schooling system because they provide access to what you're able to learn in these systems, but also allow and encourage more people who are out of school to eventually enter these traditional school systems. These policies are go hand in hand with things like scholarships, which we very much think will go away in government or will become very stagnant on government. That's very bad because of things like increasing population. But even if ALS is the prerequisite, ALS doesn't go away on our side. We still have people filling up prerequisite skills, so you don't understand why this is such a harm that we have to defend. This is all important because this is not a debate about universities, by the way. Traditional schools and everything that we defend that should expand more covers things like preschools, covers things like grade school, things that people are easily able to enter insofar as there's more political push for things like accessibility and things like expanding enrollment. The next thing they explain is on inequality, right? Inequality, especially economic inequality and people having sports cars and UPLB, does not change on either side, right? But the more important response to this is that traditional education has way more capital to reach out in far-flung and rural areas. This is important because you can't guarantee that ALS like educational institutions will have the same reach in the first place and be able to consistently fund their own practices, right? Thirdly, we don't defend status quo. To be very clear, we are able to create more scholarships on our side and build more schools. These are things that are able to solve a lot of the problems Gov pushes on us. Secondly, the next thing they say is that their side, it's decentralized with formalization, right? The first question I have is how does this guarantee ethical and proper teaching, right? This looks like how there is a risk on their side of co-optation by political dynasties in the sense of you are learning these life skills, but you only are able to learn these life skills under my rule. Therefore, you and your family have to vote for me with their guns, goons, and gold strategy. Secondly, it can be capitalized on by corporations simply because these things are less centralized, meaning it's harder to keep track of them, meaning you will have corporations exploit a lot of people, forcing them into their own workforces by expanding an ALS curriculum under the corporation's wing. Secondly, how will life skills be taught on their side? At least in traditional education, there is a centralized means for teaching of basic literature and skills, right? And ALS on government basically cannot guarantee these things. The next thing they say is that traditional school enrollment is harmful because it's inaccessible and lacks resources. We think this harm is more so for ALS because there's less resources and less resource pooling that can happen centrally, but it becomes worse in traditional schooling systems on their side when you take away or stagnate the budget. On our side, we further solve these problems. The last thing they say is that the education system is very competitive. I think this works against them because it's so competitive, we need to encourage more people in traditional schooling because that is what's seen as the more competitive thing. The weighing of all these responses is that on both sides, there will be many people in traditional education. It is about how you're able to climb the social ladder and how you're able to guarantee that you do not stay in such a lower level job, right? What are the things that Mimi brought to you? Firstly is on quality education, right? Why will ALS not be able to compete? This is how I rebuild this. Firstly, it does not represent the current preferences of the students on how they want to chase more and more degrees. If we're able to decentralize and democratize education, we can accommodate these preferences. Secondly, and this is important, a lot of students will be limited to minimum wage jobs at best because ALS is more formalized on their side, and meaning that it'll be considered by predatory corporations as enough of a levy to hire them, meaning it keeps ALS people in informal work. The conclusion of this is that they are just worse off and they stay in below minimum wage jobs, right? But even if you don't believe that, to be very, very charitable, I will explain now in my substantive that even if what everything government says is true, this limits the options of the out-of-school population, right? The framing of this is simple. You're stagnating the funding of both public schools and also trade schools, and also less tuition regulations happen on private schools. So why does this increased development and recognition on their side lead to a certain tension that will cause the limiting of options? Firstly, ALS expands their utility on government, taking up more space. Traditional schools, therefore, will have their funding slow down, and they will blame ALS in a political response, right? This means that the existing stigma will be worsen, and it is harder to shake because of the bias of formal institutions, because of employers partnering with traditional schools in the first place, meaning that there will be less and less opportunities that get squeezed out for ALS students. On our side, at least they're able to transition because ALS is more of a niche. Secondly, why is it important then that out-of-school populations enter things like traditional education and trade schools? One, there's a centralized curriculum and extracurricular activities that you're able to do. Secondly, there are incentives for more accommodating traditional school programs. Thirdly, there are opportunities to form communities under formal institutions and be socialized under usual society so that you are not othered culturally. And lastly, there's a political will for anti-poverty policies to happen due to the compassion of proximity with the entire student body, with these out-of-school youth. Lastly, how does either policy therefore manifest after schooling? Because it's very important, right? On government, employment is harder because you stay in lower level informal jobs. You are othered in society because ALS is considered as a competition rather than a bridge to formal schooling. On opposition, at least, you have a chance for economic mobility. Your degrees will be able to be used as a leverage for you, and you're able to integrate more into society. The weighing of this is that even if people learn basic life skills more on their side, it is about where they learn it and what they're able to use after it. We're able to guarantee higher and higher forms, meaning we're able to guarantee more and more dignity in employment and in education. Thank you.
Thank you, DLO. Now let's have government whip.
Hi. Hi, my name is Mary. My pronouns are she, her, and I take my POIs through voice. Could I ask, please, if I'm clear and audible?
Audible and visible.
Okay, thank you so much. Sorry. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. It is only on our side that gives the most realistic solution to problems that focus on how much education a person can get. ALS isn't meant to compete in the first place. It should be the first step into a world wherein people have to compete in any way. It's justified because it's the same reason why a lot of rich folks want to get tutors and etc. Why is it that no matter how much you try to increase regular and traditional school enrollment, like even if you lessen tuition significantly, you create more scholarship grants and you recheck the curriculum to be more in line with the geographic and proximate needs of the most vulnerable. And this is so important because they never clearly say how they actually increase the enrollment for traditional schools. We tell you it's still going to be ineffective solving these countries' most urgent concerns. We tell you that it's a fact that these all require significantly more financial needs to alleviate the situations of the school. It's cutting down the tuition and needs that students will regardless pour into. Like for example, uniforms, bags, and school supplies. The delta on our side is that ALS curriculum is going to be okay without any of those additional needs that will be added onto like the burden of students that the school system requires. They can probably make use of things they already have right now in their own homes. Like for example, in home economics, they can probably use their own clothes to fold rather than opting into extra ones that the school would rather pay for anyway. Scholarships would anyway require you to be smart or have that potential to learn. So as an out of school youth, you probably cannot even afford to do that or have the potential to be seen in you. Because the more that you advance traditional schools without recognizing their legitimacy of non-formal schooling, you push more people into disparity. But the second thing is, it's a fact that you don't allow more students to acquire the most proximate needs that they must have at the moment right now. Because many school curriculums promote based on the base completion of your requirements. So it doesn't matter if you cheat your way on the top or not, or even on the basis of age. So if you're 13 plus, you should be out of middle school by now, or even on the basis of completion over a certain deadline. You see, the principal reason why LO says it's so important to go to traditional schools is because you're required to do so because of like norms. You can get a resume, and ALS isn't that recognized. But I think those aren't fair standards. The reason why people think that they have to go to regular school is because they'll be nothing without it, and that leads them to do all sorts of stuff just to graduate, whether it's justified or not. Even if they don't understand how statistics and probability can directly aid their life, they don't know the difference between like there. They can't apply anything anywhere else. So even if at their best case they can get jobs or whatever, it's probably still going to be at the short term because they don't have the basic literacy skills. They don't have the fundamentally skills to even help them stay afloat and allow them to reach their like physiological needs. I'll go on to then like some miscellaneous rebuttals, right? They talk about like community learning systems, how it's probably going to be like students from DLSU teaching or whatever. We tell you that this is still going to be bad or ineffective because you put the burden of the government to these students to teach who probably have their own burdens in life as well. But the second thing is that out of school youth comprise only a small percentage of the population. But we tell you again that this is untrue. But even then, we tell you that the option has to exist and has to be legitimized for more people to understand the different options they can go into even if it's not just traditional schools, right? We tell you that this is going to be the leeway to other things that they can probably that they probably want to reach, whether it's going to be, for example, working already, financially funding their family or whatever. We already told you that the current system doesn't work, and that stresses the urgency to have a switch to better alternatives, right? LO said, let's move on then to like the biggest skill before I move on to more centralized rebuttals in regards to my issues, right? We tell you that LO tells you then that these traditional schools are the entryway to success. We've already responded to this by saying that because the current traditional systems right now overall lack the focus on the individual needs of students because of the lack of teachers and resources, we tell you that that no longer works, that you get the prerequisite to even have a fighting chance to get by these traditional schools. They never respond to these students failing behind, right? They never explain how they get these skills effectively. It's only on government that tells you how our side is a prerequisite to get more centralized focus towards ALS. And very quickly on DLO, right? They mentioned that problems such as being co-opted by political incentives and ethical practice and etc. We tell you that this is not mutually exclusive. This is still happening right now because even the small traditional schools given in these rural areas aren't being actively monitored by like the government given urban centralizations. There's a lot of there's a lot of like politicking happening within these traditional school systems that
You're
also
right.
aren't being met. But at the very least on our side is the fact that we have the basic literacy for people on or like we grant them the basic skills to actually identify what's happening and understand like just basic language and etc. We address that through our model by investing into the school so that the implementation and quality of ALS becomes better. Now, very quickly onto more centralized like rebuttals, right? They tell you that it's not enough to uplift people from an impoverished state. That ALS only has a limited capacity to expand on important things like financial literacy and etc. We think that ALS, of course, isn't meant to eradicate traditional school systems because we both concede that it's supposed to be supplementary. But the reason why many youth are out of school, even adults, is because education isn't equal. They didn't
You're
get
right.
their needed intention. It's hard to keep up or it's intimidating. What then does this imply? At the very least, we tell you that it's going to be an entryway to further education. But even if it doesn't, at least it's the easiest way to learn how to be self-resilient and independent in skills. The same way that job seminars can help people look for jobs, or the same way health seminars can aid people into looking out for specific signs and symptoms and care for themselves, knowing that these other institutions have failed them to do so, so they have to opt into things that are more proximate to them, things that are more digestible. That it's not only jobs you can enter, but perhaps look for better jobs that don't necessarily require you to hold a certificate, but the ones that are good enough to pay for your basic like physiological needs. It's a fact that it's catering to a specific marginalized youth that makes it the most important and most urgent thing that we must have right now. So in terms of like weighing on like the basis of gravity and like on the basis of like these vulnerable and marginalized actors, we tell you that we already win and you characterize them further compared to opposition. But even then, if traditional systems are still going to be far worse on our side and you're pouring more information and manpower towards ALS, we're still willing to take that trade-off. Angela already tells you that the marginalized comprise the most of the population. The traditional systems are inaccessible and only serve the rich in any case because people who enroll in traditional systems are still going to like create that large disparity, right? We still tell you that even if ALS still exists on your side, we think that the recognition isn't enough to legitimize it and empower people to take on a different pathway, especially a pathway against a system that has failed them in the past. With that, I'm very proud to propose.
Thank you, Gov Whip. Now let's have opposition whip.
Hello, just give me a second to fix my notes. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. ALS was never made as a ban. Wait, sorry. Restarting. Give me a second. ALS was made as a band-aid solution to societal issues which made it difficult for individuals to access traditional schooling. When government accepts this as a permanent solution, they concretize underlying inequalities and they accept that education can never be changed for the better. I think the extent of a lot of government argumentation is just to say that education is bad. However, they aren't really able to explain the instances in which ALS is necessarily problematic right now, other than to say that at the point where you pour in a lot more resources, they're going to get the recognition that they deserve. I think that what we're able to say then, coming from opposition, is that even if you pour in these resources, they aren't really able to guarantee the extent of change in that ALS is suddenly going to become more recognizable to the job market, in that people are going to get jobs that weren't already there within the past status quo. I think that what we need to note is that ALS is something that is non-formal, right? It's not something that can guarantee you the same degrees. It's not something that can guarantee you the same breadth of opportunities. Meaning that even if you are able to expand access to ALS, the extent to which people are able to benefit is incredibly limited. I want to talk about two things in this speech then. The first on access and the second on quality. On the first on access, government tries to push that we end up limiting access to education in two ways. The first is on marginalized individuals and not having forms of education that they can use. So for instance, their argumentation of PWDs not having infrastructure, the argumentation on indigenous people not having schools near them. I think that what we're able to point out coming from both speakers is that all of these issues come from a current lack of funding that goes towards traditional education right now. They say that ALS is better because it caters towards these people. However, note again that this is a band-aid solution. If we're able to fix this lack of funding even before they resort to ALS, I think we're able to keep these people within the traditional school system. These are marginalized people who are just far better off on our side. What we're able to explain quite clearly is that by focusing on traditional education, it just means that the state has more of an incentive to fix this insofar as one, the priorities are not split, but two, it's just that there's a lot more attention put on it at this point in time. At the point where we end up focusing on the recognition and development of ALS, note that this legitimizes it as a option for all individuals and not just those who are marginalized on your side if it does succeed. Meaning that at this point, if people do see it as an option, it means that they're going to opt into it in a lot of instances where it just might be more convenient and not necessarily better. We were able to explain that at the point where people do want more from our side, it necessarily pushes the state to explain why education is lacking right now. So in terms of this, we are able to get one, just a lot more media attention that pushes on the state to fix a lot of issues with this sort of infrastructure and that is able to offer these options towards these marginalized groups as to being able to have traditional education and not just ALS. But two, it's also just further direct political incentives to continue being elected. I think that all of these just aren't present on your side at the point in time where ALS is not is treated as like a stopgap solution. The second thing then on how we're able to just provide more access is the fact that traditional schools do focus on everyone, which they aren't really able to respond to. What they point out on their side is that traditional schools only focus on the elite insofar as only, for instance, a few people are able to get into university. We were able to explain that it's quite untrue. And so far as this is able to cover basic education, this means that people are at the point in time where you invest in traditional education and it becomes better, are able to go to better kindergartens. They're better able to go to elementary school. They're better able to go to high school. All of these things are important in being able to just create a more educated and prepared populace. When you listen to the language of government tone, then note that a lot of these are the same things that they want, right? Insofar as they say that they want things such as more specialized education, they want education that caters towards these individuals. What I want to note is that coming from their side, I'm unsure as to why this is necessarily ALS as opposed to the model that we claim on trad schools. So for instance, on the ability of schools to become more specialized over time, on the ability of schools to focus on specific regions, I think that this is something that can happen on our side for two reasons. The first is because of the fact that education is often taught regionally by individuals. I mean, at the point in time where people are able to, for instance, adjust to meaning at the point in time where this traditional schools are within specific areas, we think that there's inherently an incentive to make sure that it's able to adjust to their learning speed. So if all these people within a particular area are poor and marginalized and aren't able to learn to the same speed as the global standard, what this means is that teachers aren't just going to teach to the global standard because obviously they'll get low scores if no one in the class understands. They're going to teach lower. And we think that this engages with a lot of their benefits then on as to why ALS is better. We're still able to attain it. But the second is because we think that we're able to just cater towards the vulnerable actors that they talk about and provide them optionality. For those who want to go into traditional school on our side, because of the ways that we expand funding, we think that this means that we're able to at least ensure that they are going to be catered to. On their side, if you just focus on ALS, what this means is that they become a smaller and smaller pot of slice of the pie, and this just means that the state doesn't want to fix this overall. So if they say that traditional schools are only for the elite, what we think happens on their side, that we think that that's something that only exists on their side with more people in traditional schooling. It just means that there's more of an incentive to make it less elitist as a whole. Insofar as opposition pushes for things such as, let's say, tuition regulations, expanding infrastructure, and lowering poverty rates, all in the quest of just making traditional school enrollment go faster, what we're able to do is to fix a lot of current issues within the status quo that affect the more in number, but also just minorities more within this instance. What government needed to defend on their side was as to why expanding isn't particularly important. They just say that ALS is better in these instances. I'm still unsure as to why they didn't necessarily get the quality that they want. But secondly, on quality then, given that we're already able to push access, what we need to note at the end of the day is that these are non-formal institutions. Based on the inflow side, this just gives basic literacy and life skills. And oftentimes, this isn't something that necessarily brings you into a better job market. It's only able to give you minimum wage jobs. They say that recognition is going to mean that you get better jobs. However, note that this isn't something that happens insofar as note that this isn't something that happens insofar as one, there's still a difference between graduates of ALS and traditional school models in terms of what they learn, meaning that there's inherently a priority of with better quality because, these companies still have a profit incentive. But two, it's also just the fact that even though these out of school youths have graduated from ALS, they still feel a lot of stigma at this point in time. So given this, we aren't unsure as to why they are able to get a lot of the opportunities that they want in terms of how quality is viewed. But secondly, in terms of how quality actually happens within the debate, given that they aren't really able to discuss the main source of who exactly is going to these schools, which are out of school youth, I think that they aren't really able to engage with why we want them in traditional schooling to begin with. Traditional schooling is just far more stable. It's just where people can spend the most amount of time and effort on just focusing on school as opposed to dealing with the issues of the world. If you focus on their side, where it's constantly ALS, where you aren't able to encourage people to go to institutions where it's just focused on learning, oftentimes their learning is going to be at the side. They're going to have to do things such as work as well as while they're studying. They're going to have to do things such as study in an incredibly crowded house where they aren't able to focus completely on their education. I mean that even if they are able to improve on ALS specifically on their side, they are never able to improve the conditions in which people learn. So at the end of the day, what we're able to prove on quality is that insofar as traditional education is more targeted towards individuals in a set environment, we just prove that it's better for them as a whole. For these reasons and more, even if ALS becomes smaller, we would take the trade-off because it just means that more people get a better form of education.
Thank you, OpWeb. Now let's have opposition reply.
Firstly, where are out-of-school youth better off? I want to point out that Gov functions on a very small pocket of the context that we are able to provide. The first piece of framing that they explain is that ALS must be expanded because traditional schools are lacking. And this does not fulfill the burden of the trade-off of simply undermining the existing mechanisms of expanding the access in traditional schools that we were able to illustrate to you. On our side, we are able to prove that out-of-school youth are able to climb the social ladder and climb the economic mobility ladder way more in the sense that ALS is not considered the be-all end-all of their education and of their schooling. Take note, we were able to frame this quite clearly when we explain that in other places in society or in society in general, there are incentives by corporations and incentives by the government to keep people in a lot of low skill and low level work. This will just exacerbate on their side. The next context they explain is that ALS is the only prerequisite to learning basic life skills. I think if that is the case, we still win over them because we still have ALS mechanisms on our side, and we are already able to weigh off the larger harms by explaining that ALS students are actually more harmed on our side in the sense that they are not going to just go to traditional schooling afterwards for multiple reasons. Firstly, we explain that they aren't able to go to traditional schooling after ALS and government because enrollment is not expanded and accommodated for them. There are no scholarships for them. And because of this, and the second reason that we explain is that they don't go to traditional schools after ALS. They immediately go into the workforce. We explain how this was harmful because it exacerbates exploitation. It proves to companies that because ALS is more formalized, we can give them like lower than minimum wage jobs simply because the life skills that they learn are because they just learn basic life skills and literacy and they will not demand for anything more. The third context that they explain is that ALS will be expanded and developed, but not compete. Take note that this is assertive and does not respond or disprove a lot of our analysis on why it creates political tension, why this the simple case just by the motion itself, by the virtue of it itself, you are stopping the funding of traditional schools, which include trade schools and private schools, which means that there will be a certain response to it by these institutions. This is competition in of itself. I think they were not able to weigh this out or even disprove it. So in for the first part of my reply speech, I'm just explaining to you that they did not take a sound trade-off. So we understand that their principle is like fairly decent, but they don't take the trade-off that this motion demands of them. Why is it okay that because of all the problems that they explain, that traditional schools are not enough in like multiple ways, that we should not expand enrollment, right? But secondly, and this I think this is the question that only we were able to answer. Where are traditional schools better? The way I want to explain why this is an important question is because down the bench, we explain that there are still millions and millions of people in traditional schools. We still explain that if you want to talk about marginalized groups in government, they still exist in traditional schooling systems. There are still indigenous people in UP. There are still, like in many public rural schools, there are still people in the like below the poverty line and those who are like generally marginalized. But we are able to answer this question in two ways. Firstly, it is when you expand enrollment. We illustrated this through simple funding of infrastructure and scholarships because expanding enrollment requires creating space for that enrollment, right? How did government respond and weigh this out? They really didn't. But if ALS on their side, and this is their implicit weighing that I'm being very charitable, if it does serve the marginalized, and if there's such an urgency to serve the marginalized, they don't necessarily prove that this is exclusive, or they don't prove what's next after serving the marginalized in these ALS systems, because ALS can only do so much as explained by Mimi and Elle. Secondly, we explained that traditional schools are better when you don't stop their funding. Because on government, it becomes more elitist simply because it's less accessible, it's more culturally hegemonic in places like the LSU, and people are angrier at the ALS institutions for being the reason for stopping and slowing down their budget. Gov does not respond to this, so I think we take this on quite a clear margin. Thank you.
Thank you, Op reply. And now to end the debate, let's have government reply. Gov reply.
Hello, apologies once again, but my gov reply Arab is trying to open her mic, but she's lagging daw po. She's trying.
Okay, no problem. I think she can try to reconnect and then it will probably work again.
Hello, am I audible?
Yep, audible.
Okay. Sorry for the delay. Starting with speech 10 in 3. Hold up. Wait, sorry. Give me one more. Okay, let me just say my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. I think we win this debate for clear reasons. ALS is supposed to be a band-aid solution. It's a short-term and safety net. It's literally called alternative for a reason. Even so, it's important to learn language. It's important to learn. This is a language we didn't understand when school we dropped out from, and the skills that they would be undermined and underutilized in traditional schools. Because they care more about academic needs, ask more questions because they're more seen. But even if they just go to work right after ALS, it doesn't become an entryway. It's okay because it's probably out of necessity and urgency that they must learn. It's better to have some of it than none of it. The question opposition never answers is two things. What if people follow their son from traditional learning? They have to face other multiple burdens. Traditional education will always exist for three main reasons. Because of prestige, there's a need for education, and lastly, there's an attainment for further knowledge as a basis of innovation and evolution. The problem is that there will always be an out-of-youth school on either sides. They don't do anything for them, and the poverty problem becomes cyclical. So the second is, how do you actually expand enrollment? What is their initial burden to prove? Their case is purely negative. They keep giving us the things, and they just give us like this motherhood statements like, "Oh, we're just going to make more schools, I guess, or we're going to expand our institutions and make and give more scholarships." But they ignore some of the key issues that we present that is the issue. It's not even just the schools and like not the ability to get into schools. It's the ability to go to schools hard stop period. It's the ability to find schools that are near you. It's the ability to find schools you can actually go to. This case is purely negative and barely digs as deep as to get what it means to expand enrollment. Government whip tells you that's probably going to become more marketing, assuming the financial burden, etc. But that doesn't necessarily solve anything for you. The standard for why we win is two main things there and why we win this debate. Firstly, in characterization and identification of marginalized institutions. Firstly, we win this issue on stakeholders at the point in which one, it becomes more proximate and accessible to them. Two, we minimize competition and having to catch up and letting them get the skills that they need. We recognize that's not always feasible for these people to catch up with the traditional system. In gravity, we target way more people on the ground than opposition even does. We actually answer the question how we're going to get people into education, which opposition just gives us motherhood statements on. In terms of taking down opposition, we tell you these things then. We tell you that most of the problems they cause, such as bad political incentives, bad learning systems, and lack of social engagement, the exclusive experience you get from these traditional schools are not mutually exclusive. Apart from economic disparity, we see that due to the cultural gaps and differences, they will still fall behind. For example, the Bajaus were discriminated against like very historically in the Philippines. They only respond to this intangible aspect, for example, grasping skills, etc., but never the tangible aspects. The fact that people have multiple burdens, they don't have time to always follow school schedule. So it's taxing to have to travel long distances just to get into school. And the traditional enrollment process is extremely bureaucratic. It requires so much requirements. It's really are addressed because most of these aren't present by ALS. And when they say that these people, there are still IPs in UP Diliman, the fact that they have to travel to the city just to access it, which is so bad. What are you going to do for these people that expand enrollment? Are you going to drive people to UP Diliman yourself? In terms of mechanization, we never said that we replaced the current traditional system. What we say is that we solve the burdens that opposition doesn't necessarily address by allotting more resources invested to learning these skills and ultimately focusing on the individual needs, which the current system has chosen to sacrifice and trade off for the sake of being quote unquote globally competitive. So in terms of ALS being an unofficial institution, I think that's okay. Because what we need ALS for is building these prerequisites first to be competent of having a chance at these opportunities when they have the necessary skills. We won't shortcut learning to these students and mass promote them if that means that they get the skills they need and have a better playing field and being able to learn and grasp an institutional education. At opposition, you have to travel to UP Diliman all the way there just to get an education and compete with many other students who are already having the privilege from the get-go. On our side, you have a better system. You have this better system at the comfort of your home or wherever you are before going into these universities. Thank you. I'm very proud to propose.
Thank you, government reply. That concludes the debate. Across the house, I'll be disconnecting audio for like 10 minutes and then I'll be back with the OA. Thanks, guys.
Cross, thank you so much for the debate.
Thank you so much for the
Thank
debate.
you. Thank you, guys.